I thought I was leaving him for just 3 weeks. A work trip, nothing dramatic, plane tickets booked, hotel confirmed, suitcase packed. I kissed him goodbye at the door, expecting a cheerful, "Have fun. I'll be fine." Instead, he leaned against the frame of our doorway, scratched his head, and said, "I'll hang back, game a little, order pizza." He was 41, fully capable of adulting, or so I assumed. 2 days in, I got a text. Thinking of becoming a grill master. Might need instructions. My first thought: we don't own a grill. My second: this might be the start of something catastrophic. By the time I returned from my meeting, the smoke alarm had serenaded him, or maybe itself, for 40 straight minutes. Apparently, stacking 3 baking sheets, pouring lighter fluid, and lighting them was grill-adjacent. Our oven smelled like gasoline for days, and the fire extinguisher was developing a personal vendetta against him. But that was just the appetizer. By day 3, he had discovered TikTok. A 30-minute scroll session later, he had decided our lives were too cluttered. Minimalism, he declared, was the only path to enlightenment. Within hours, half our dishes had vanished. The rest had been relegated to a vital few: 1 salad bowl, unfortunately also the dog's water dish, a single coffee mug, and a spatula. Everything else was gone. I imagined him tossing forks over his shoulder like confetti while whispering, "We only need 1 of everything." Food became a logistical nightmare. He bulk ordered 20 frozen burritos, not just a couple for convenience, 20. And by week 2, he was eating them straight from the freezer. "It's basically a cold wrap," he justified when I video called him. "Saves electricity. Laundry? Forget it." 2 pairs of basketball shorts rotated in an endless cycle. By the time I returned, they had fused into something resembling denim-adjacent cardboard. The dog, a normally cheerful golden retriever, started growling whenever he sat down. I had imagined coming home to a house slightly messy but intact. Instead, I returned to a living room that smelled like burnt plastic and ranch dressing, the unmistakable scent of chaos. My husband sat shirtless, holding a recorder he had impulsively purchased on Amazon because, in his words, Mozart slapped. And somewhere between the smoke alarm, the burrito pile, and the minimalist purging, I realized the man I had left behind for 3 weeks had completely reinvented himself, or perhaps destroyed himself entirely. And now, here I sit in a cafe, sipping coffee like it's communion wine, staring at my phone, scrolling through photos of our empty kitchen cabinets, the half-eaten burritos, and 2 pairs of fused basketball shorts. Outside, people walk by, oblivious to the domestic apocalypse that awaits them just a few blocks away. I glance at the barista and shake my head when asked if I want almond milk. No thanks. My house is already nut-based chaos. And honestly, at this point, I wished he had just cheated instead. Anything might have been easier to recover from than this. By the 4th day, it was clear that my husband had entered a new era, one I can only describe as the reign of the burrito overlord. Our fridge had become a frozen fortress, a monument to 20 identical rectangle-shaped meals. Each burrito was wrapped in plastic, like a tiny prisoner, waiting for release, or at least partial thawing. I called him during lunch, expecting a cheerful update about how he had finally discovered the microwave. Instead, he answered with a solemn, almost ceremonial tone, "I am the burrito." "What?" I blinked at my desk, coffee halfway to my lips. "I am the burrito," he repeated. "Cold on the outside, warm inside. Efficient, powerful, transcendent." I laughed nervously. I wasn't sure if he was joking. By now, a normal response might have been a fire drill, a trip to the hospital, or a call to someone who knew how to deal with a man talking about being a burrito. But he was completely serious. And somehow, he made it sound poetic. By the end of the day, he had created a burrito rotation system, complete with a spreadsheet I did not ask for. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, frozen, semi-thawed, reheated. It was like living with a tiny, tortilla-covered dictator. The dog refused to approach the table, instead choosing to sulk under the counter, occasionally growling at his master's burrito worship. Laundry had become an afterthought in this new world order. 2 pairs of shorts, fused into something between cardboard and denim, were all he wore. He claimed they were enhanced for burrito efficiency, but I suspect it was simply the result of neglect. The dog seemed to agree. Every time my husband tried to sit down, a low growl filled the room, as if the furniture itself were protesting. By week 5, he had expanded his culinary empire. He attempted gourmet burrito experiments, adding toppings like mustard, ranch, and occasionally a lonely pickle he found in the fridge. Smoke alarms, now well acquainted with his culinary escapades, greeted each experiment with a symphony of screeches. Our neighbors probably thought we were hosting a firework display in the kitchen. I called him again via video. His background was a blurry haze of smoke, plastic wrappers, and empty containers. He was shirtless naturally because apparently clothing was optional in the burrito kingdom. He lifted a half-frozen burrito like a sacred relic. "Behold," he said, "the ultimate form." I couldn't argue. At this point, I didn't even try. My husband was living in a different reality, one that involved no laundry, minimal dishes, and a strict devotion to frozen meals. I only prayed for the dog, who had now taken permanent residence in the bathtub, and for my kitchen, which smelled permanently of ranch dressing and regret. By the time I hung up, I realized I hadn't heard him laugh once in these 3 weeks. Not out of happiness, not out of joy, just solemn commitment to burrito transcendence. I made a mental note. When I returned, I might need to stage an intervention, or maybe just install a grill and hand him a fire extinguisher. Either way, I suspected the man who had once enjoyed a simple slice of pizza was gone forever, and in his place lived the burrito overlord. By the start of the second week, my husband had fully embraced his new philosophy, minimalism, or as he called it, the path to enlightenment through strategic decluttering. I had envisioned him maybe throwing out old magazines or mismatched socks. Instead, he had transformed our home into a barren shrine to his interpretation of simplicity. The first casualties were the dishes. Drawers once filled with plates, bowls, and utensils now echoed with emptiness. He had strategically decided we only needed one bowl per person. Unfortunately, his logic was questionable. He kept the salad bowl, the dog's water dish. Everything else? Gone. I imagined him standing over the trash bin, nodding proudly as forks, spoons, and Tupperware cascaded like confetti. The next target was furniture. The coffee table? Unnecessary. The side chairs? Redundant. The couch? We sit too much anyway. By day 10, the living room resembled a minimalist's fever dream. Bare floors, a single chair, and a faint smell of burnt plastic lingering from his previous culinary experiments. Feeding himself became a performance art. Frozen burritos were no longer enough. He had discovered condiments. Ranch, mustard, ketchup, all added to his burrito consumption in abstract combinations. One night, he even experimented with a burrito lasagna, layering tortillas with cheese and frozen beans in a casserole dish. Smoke alarms responded with the same stoic indignation as always, while the dog retreated further into the bathtub, eyes wide with terror. Laundry remained untouched. The 2 pairs of basketball shorts, fused into an unholy textile union, were now his entire wardrobe. He insisted they were optimized for mobility, though mobility mostly consisted of pacing in the living room, muttering about the burrito. The dog, exhausted from navigating this new minimalist landscape, had begun growling at everything, the chair, the floor, even me, as if warning me of impending chaos. He discovered new hobbies, too. Origami became a nightly ritual. He folded what looked like abstract representations of burritos out of printer paper, carefully lining them up on the kitchen counter. I imagined walking in, expecting dinner, and instead finding a miniature paper burrito army guarding our last remaining salad bowl. By the end of the second week, I realized I didn't recognize my husband anymore. The man who had once planned our vacations and folded laundry with pride had transformed into a smoke-emitting, burrito-obsessed, minimalist zealot. He no longer responded to normal conversation. Instead, he muttered cryptic phrases about efficiency, condensation, and the true essence of a tortilla. I started to question my life choices. Leaving him alone for 3 weeks seemed like a reasonable idea at the time. In hindsight, it had been a terrible mistake. Now, as I sat in my hotel room scrolling through the photos of his handiwork, smoke-stained oven, empty drawers, and 2 fused basketball shorts, I couldn't help but wonder if anything could save him, or the dog, or my sanity. By the middle of the 3rd week, my husband had fully embraced what I now call experimental arts. The burrito empire and minimalist purge were no longer enough. He had discovered the recorder. Yes, the humble plastic wind instrument that makes every song sound slightly like a confused duck. He ordered it off Amazon because, in his words, Mozart slapped. When I called him that morning, I heard it immediately, a high-pitched warbling note echoing through the phone speaker. "Practice makes perfect," he said solemnly, like a monk reciting a sacred mantra. Behind him, the faint smell of burnt plastic mingled with lingering ranch dressing, a scent now permanently etched into my memory. The living room, already stripped of furniture, had become his concert hall. A single chair stood in the center as his podium, a fortress of burrito wrappers forming the orchestra pit. He played for hours, sometimes staring intently at the wall, sometimes closing his eyes and swaying to rhythms that existed only in his head. The dog had long since retreated to the bathtub, growling at anything that moved. Meals had become performances, too. He invented burrito accompaniment, where he would play the recorder while eating, each note synchronized with a bite. According to him, it improved flavor. I was skeptical. I did not imagine that classical music could make partially frozen burritos taste better, but I had stopped questioning his logic weeks ago. Laundry remained untouched. The fused basketball shorts had now become part of his uniform for artistic immersion. He insisted they enhanced wind control and burrito consumption efficiency. The dog occasionally dared to peek out from the bathtub, assessing the situation, then retreated again with a look of deep existential despair. The apartment smelled like a strange combination of plastic, burned cheese, and regret. I imagined walking in and immediately collapsing in a heap. Even the dog, my loyal companion, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He was traumatized. I considered naming him a survivor of a domestic apocalypse. Every night before bed, my husband would stand in the living room, recorder in hand, and declare, "I am one with the music. I am the burrito. I am minimalism." Sometimes I thought he might be joking. Then I remembered the spreadsheet of burrito consumption, the discarded dishes, and the smoke-stained oven. He was not joking. He was completely serious. I began to dread my return home. How do you even begin to explain 3 weeks of solo chaos? How do you restore a man who has become a burrito-playing minimalist musician? And more importantly, how do you convince a traumatized dog that life is safe again? By the end of week 3, I knew one thing for certain. Nothing could prepare me for walking through that door. My husband had redefined reality. My home had become a stage, a battleground, and a shrine all at once. And I, standing outside with my suitcase, could only hope that somewhere inside, the man I married still existed beneath the burrito, the smoke, and the high-pitched recorder notes. By the end of the 3rd week, it was no longer a question of what my husband was doing. It was a question of whether anyone or anything could survive in our apartment. The dog, once cheerful and enthusiastic, had staged what could only be called a tactical retreat. He had claimed the bathtub as his fortress, growling at intruders, me, and even the floor. I half expected him to start issuing commands in canine Morse code. The burrito empire remained strong. My husband had refined his diet to what he now called strategic efficiency. He rotated frozen burritos with precision, some semi-thawed, some fully frozen, all eaten in the solemn reverence of a man who had become one with his food. The smoke alarms, familiar with this ritual by now, had taken on the role of silent witnesses, beeping occasionally as if to remind him of the thin line between culinary experimentation and domestic disaster. Laundry had reached a critical state. The 2 fused basketball shorts had evolved into something I could only describe as a textile weapon. They were stiff, unyielding, and somehow coated in a faint layer of burrito crumbs. My husband claimed they improved wind resistance for his recorder practice. I did not argue. Meanwhile, the dog had begun to express his displeasure through a variety of creative measures. He banged his water dish against the tub walls, refused to eat, and occasionally stared at my husband with an intensity that suggested he was considering intervention. I began to sympathize. At this point, I was not sure who was more traumatized, the dog or me. My husband had discovered a new hobby: indoor camping. He set up a makeshift tent in the living room using bedsheets, the chair podium, and leftover burrito wrappers. He claimed it helped with mindfulness and air circulation. The dog, of course, refused to enter the tent. I imagined him observing from the bathtub, silently judging every decision. Video calls had become surreal experiences. He would answer with the recorder in one hand, a burrito in the other, and a solemn expression. "The burrito observes all," he said once before launching into a 5-minute solo accompanied by the muffled sounds of the dog growling in the background. I started to question my sanity. Leaving him alone for 3 weeks had seemed reasonable. Returning to a home filled with smoke, half-eaten burritos, and a traumatized dog was less reasonable. I began drafting contingency plans. Perhaps a professional intervention, perhaps a gentle removal of all burritos, perhaps a negotiation with the dog. By the end of this week, I realized something terrifying. I did not recognize my husband. The man who had once been predictable, responsible, and mildly amusing had transformed into something uncharted. He was the burrito overlord, the minimalist maestro, the recorder virtuoso, and the dog. The dog had seen things no living creature should ever see. As I sipped my coffee in a nearby cafe, I took a deep breath and whispered, a quiet prayer. May my home survive the final 2 days of this chaos, and may I, somehow, survive the sight of my husband playing the recorder while wearing fused basketball shorts. By the beginning of week 4, my husband's solo adventure had reached an entirely new level of absurdity. The burrito empire, the minimalist purge, and the recorder symphonies were now joined by what he called experimental living arts. I didn't understand it, but it was happening. And it was happening fast. He had invented a new morning ritual. Every day began with a solemn bow to the single salad bowl, followed by a burrito meditation, in which he would rotate through 3 frozen burritos, staring deeply into each one as if searching for the meaning of life within the tortilla. The dog, a silent and terrified observer, had taken to lying on the bathtub rim, shaking slightly, as if ready to evacuate at a moment's notice. Laundry had become a distant memory. The fused basketball shorts had now acquired an almost mythical status. He called them the shorts of ultimate efficiency, claiming they enhanced flexibility, burrito handling, and recorder sound projection. I was not sure how any of that was true, but he was incredibly persuasive about it, nodding solemnly while holding a half-thawed burrito. He had also embraced extreme minimalism in his daily movement. Walking from the kitchen to the living room, a mere 10 feet, became a ceremonious journey. Each step was accompanied by a low hum and occasional recorder notes. The smoke alarm, our only consistent witness, remained silent. Perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of exhaustion. The dog's trauma had reached critical mass. He refused to drink from anything other than the single salad bowl, which had been repurposed as a hybrid water source. Food was ignored entirely, unless delivered by me, posthumously, from the kitchen of my imagination. I began to consider enlisting a therapist, both for the dog and for myself. At night, my husband transformed into a nocturnal philosopher. Shirtless, shorts fused, burrito in hand, he would pace the living room and mutter, "I am the burrito. I am minimalism. I am music." The dog would watch from the bathtub, eyes wide, occasionally letting out a resigned sigh that sounded remarkably human. By the end of week 4, I realized that nothing I had ever imagined could prepare me for my return. The man who had once loved pizza and casual TV nights was now an unrecognizable hybrid of performance, artist, food monk, and minimalist zealot. I had visions of walking through the door and finding him atop a mountain of burrito wrappers, reciting Mozart while balancing the last remaining fork on his nose. I took another sip of my cafe coffee and tried to steady my nerves. 3 weeks had transformed my husband into a creature of absurd devotion, a master of chaos. And while I wasn't sure whether to laugh, cry, or call the fire department, one thing was clear. My home would never be the same again. The only question that remained, could my sanity survive witnessing the final, inevitable crescendo of this 3-week odyssey? By week 5, my husband had officially turned our apartment into a monument to chaos disguised as minimalism. He had removed almost everything from sight, leaving only the essentials, or what he considered essentials. 1 chair, 1 salad bowl, 2 fused basketball shorts, a recorder, and a mountain of burrito wrappers formed the core of his new world. The smoke alarm had stopped complaining. I suspect it had given up entirely, choosing instead to silently mourn the oven and the scorched countertops. My husband, meanwhile, had embraced the silence as sacred, claiming it enhanced the burrito experience. I did not argue. I had learned that resistance only prolonged the inevitable absurdity. He had also discovered a new hobby, indoor parkour. Using the remaining furniture, the burrito piles, and strategically placed floor mats, he leapt and hopped around the apartment in what he described as minimalist movement exercises. The dog, predictably, had barricaded himself in the bathtub, occasionally peeking out to witness the spectacle before retreating further into his fortress. Meals had become a ceremonial event. Each burrito was treated with reverence, rotated 3 times clockwise, and eaten to the accompaniment of random recorder notes. Occasionally, he would pause mid-bite to meditate, holding the burrito aloft and proclaiming, "I am one with the burrito, and the burrito is one with me." The dog, ever vigilant, growled softly as if to say, "This is madness." Laundry was now purely symbolic. The fused shorts were sacred, untouchable, and entirely irreplaceable. My husband insisted they were engineered for maximum burrito absorption and sound projection. I did not question him. At this point, questioning seemed irrelevant. He had also started rearranging the remaining items in the apartment according to some secret minimalist algorithm. The salad bowl moved daily, the recorder shifted positions, and the burrito piles followed a strict geometric pattern. I imagined him, staring at the arrangement with intense satisfaction, convinced he had achieved perfection. By the end of week 5, the apartment had become a surreal museum, a shrine to burritos, a temple of minimalism, and a concert hall for solo recorder performances. The dog had withdrawn completely, refusing to move except for the most basic survival needs. I considered introducing him to a professional canine therapist, or perhaps a hazmat team. Sipping coffee in my hotel cafe, I realized that my return home would be less of a homecoming and more of an expedition into uncharted absurdity. I could only hope that somewhere beneath the burrito, the fused shorts, and the recorder melodies, the man I married still existed. Or at least that the dog survived long enough to witness my arrival. By the 6th week, my husband's routines had reached a level of absurd intensity that I could scarcely imagine surviving. The burrito rituals had evolved into a full-blown spiritual practice. Each meal was now accompanied by a meticulously timed recorder solo, complete with crescendos and pauses, as if Mozart himself had returned to oversee the consumption of frozen Mexican cuisine. The dog had officially gone off the grid. He now lived entirely in the bathtub, emerging only at night to scavenge for scraps. Occasionally, he would bark a warning, presumably to remind my husband that even a burrito monk must respect the laws of canine territory. But the message was lost in the whirlwind of frozen meals, minimalism, and shrill recorder notes. The apartment itself had become a surreal gallery. Burrito wrappers formed geometric patterns across the floor, each wrapper carefully folded in half and placed at an exact distance from the next. The fused basketball shorts had been elevated to altar status on a chair in the middle of the room. My husband would bow to them daily, murmuring phrases about efficiency, flexibility, and burrito absorption. Laundry had become completely irrelevant. The shorts were untouchable, sacred relics, and everything else had been discarded in the name of minimalism. He claimed that any attempt to launder them would disrupt the spiritual harmony of the apartment. The dog growled in agreement, or perhaps in despair. I was not sure. His new hobbies included interpretive dance. He would pace the living room, spinning and hopping, while holding a burrito in one hand and the recorder in the other. Sometimes he would pause mid-performance to meditate, staring at the salad bowl as if it were the source of all wisdom. The smoke alarm remained silent, either resigned or genuinely impressed by his dedication. I imagined my return home with a mixture of dread and dark curiosity. How does one reintegrate a man who has become a hybrid of performance artist, burrito monk, and minimalist zealot? How does one restore a home that has been transformed into a shrine to absurdity? And more importantly, how does one coax a traumatized dog from a bathtub fortress that now resembled a post-apocalyptic bunker? By the end of week 6, I realized something frightening. The man I had left was gone. In his place was a being who existed entirely within his own chaotic rules, a master of frozen burrito consumption, minimalism, and self-imposed rituals. The apartment had become a living testament to the power of 3 weeks alone, and I could only hope that I had the courage to face it. By week 7, the apocalypse of my apartment had reached its peak. My husband, now fully entrenched in his self-made world, had created routines and rituals that defied all logic. Burrito consumption had become ceremonial, the recorder was played at all hours, and the fused basketball shorts had assumed an almost religious significance. Minimalism was no longer a choice, it was law. The dog had completely abandoned hope. He lived permanently in the bathtub, eyes wide, watching my husband with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Occasionally he would bark, not in anger, but as a desperate plea. Help me. I felt that plea in my chest even from miles away, sipping coffee in yet another cafe far from the smoke-filled, absurd chaos that awaited me. My husband had invented new efficiency rituals. Each morning began with stretching exercises designed to enhance burrito handling, followed by a recorder warm-up that lasted at least 30 minutes. Meals were eaten in precise rotations, frozen burritos arranged in geometric formations. He had also begun talking to the burritos, asking them questions and nodding solemnly at the answers he imagined receiving. Laundry was now entirely ceremonial. The fused basketball shorts had become sacred relics, placed on a chair as if on a throne. My husband would bow, mutter incantations about flexibility and efficiency, and then continue his day in an endless loop of ritualistic devotion. The smoke alarm, ever faithful, had finally stopped beeping, either out of exhaustion or resignation. I began preparing for my return. I packed emergency cleaning supplies, extra bowls, and a case of frozen burritos, just in case. I rehearsed conversations in my head. Yes, honey, I see you've evolved. Yes, I understand the importance of the burrito. No, I don't think we need another minimalist purge. None of it felt sufficient. I imagined walking through the door, greeted by the smell of burnt plastic and ranch dressing. My husband, shirtless, shorts fused, holding a burrito like a scepter, playing the recorder with solemn intensity. The dog, perched in the bathtub, would stare at me as if to ask, "Did you really leave me here?" As the plane touched down, I realized that this wasn't just a homecoming. It was an expedition into a surreal, self-created world that my husband had built in my absence. A world where frozen burritos were sacred, minimalism was law, and the recorder reigned supreme. And somewhere in that chaos, I would have to find the man I married. The moment I opened the door, I knew nothing would ever be the same. Smoke clung stubbornly to the walls, and the faint aroma of burnt plastic and ranch dressing assaulted my senses. My husband stood in the center of the living room, shirtless, fused basketball shorts, glinting like sacred armor, burrito in one hand, recorder in the other. He bowed solemnly. "I am the burrito," he intoned. I blinked. "And I am minimalism." The dog growled from his bathtub fortress, eyes wide with the kind of horror reserved for witnessing ancient, unspeakable magic. I froze. I had expected chaos, but this was a full-blown domestic apocalypse. I set down my suitcase, took a deep breath, and surveyed the battlefield. Burrito wrappers covered the floor in intricate geometric patterns. The single salad bowl sat on the counter like a throne. The recorder rested on a chair podium, and the fused basketball shorts gleamed in their altar-like glory. I sighed, a mixture of disbelief, exhaustion, and reluctant amusement washing over me. Slowly, I began the process of reclaiming my home. First, the dog, carefully coaxed him out of the bathtub with treats and soothing words. Next, the burritos. Half eaten, half frozen, all piled neatly into a container for emergency consumption. The recorder? Well, it stayed, as long as it didn't shriek in the middle of the night. My husband, surprisingly, was cooperative. Perhaps he sensed the absurdity of his reign, or perhaps he simply recognized my authority had returned. He agreed to donate some of the burrito stockpile to a friend, to wash at least one plate, and to retire the fused shorts from daily use. Minimalism remained, but in moderation. That night, for the first time in 3 weeks, our apartment smelled like something other than burnt plastic and ranch. The dog curled up on the couch. My husband and I shared a quiet dinner, real food this time, and laughed about the chaos of the past weeks. In hindsight, I realized leaving him alone had been a mistake, but it had also revealed something unexpected: resilience, creativity, and a capacity for absurdity that I hadn't known existed. And yes, it had been terrifying, frustrating, and occasionally hilarious. As I went to bed, I whispered a quiet thank you to the universe. My husband was still himself, in some twisted, burrito-fueled way. The dog survived, and the house, well, it would take a little longer to recover. 3 weeks of chaos, 3 weeks of learning. And while I hoped never to repeat the experiment, I knew one thing for sure: life with him would never be boring. 3 weeks, 1 burrito-obsessed husband, fused shorts, and a traumatized dog. If that made you laugh, smash like, subscribe, and follow for more domestic disasters you'll be glad you only read about.